It is really a privilege today to have, in difficult circumstances and on a very complicated and difficult topic, such a fantastic expert panel with us today. We are here, of course, to talk about Israel, Hezbollah, and the potential for full-scale war and what the implications of all of that would be. For those who don't know, my name is Debra Shushan, and I am the Director of Policy here at J Street. In terms of this topic, this has been a key concern, not only for J Street since October 7th, but certainly for the Biden administration as well. The potential for not only an escalation on Israel's northern border with Hezbollah, but also a broader regional escalation that would include other players supported by Iran, in particular, the Houthis, Iranian-supported groups in Iraq and Syria. And of course, with Hezbollah's opportunistic attack on October 8th and the continuing conflict, kinetic conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, that have traded thousands of rockets and missile attacks on a near daily basis, this has been an ongoing and very serious concern. We have mass displacement of both Israelis from the northern part of Israel, as well as Lebanese civilians from southern Lebanon. Over a total of 150,000 civilians have been displaced from their homes in both countries. And we have seen the tempo and intensity of attacks on both sides of the de facto Israeli-Lebanese border have increased in the past several weeks. And there are some analysts who have indicated that they think war between the two sides is becoming inevitable. We see major engagement on this issue from the Biden administration at the highest levels by Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin, as well as the trip to the region, Israel and Lebanon, by Amos Hochstein, an envoy who is extremely capable on these issues, helped to negotiate a maritime agreement when the previous Israeli government was in power under Yair Lapid, between Israel and Lebanon. So he is someone who's been involved on these issues for a long time. So we're going to get started on our discussion on these topics and hear from our experts. I will remind our audience and let our audience members, anyone who's new, know that as part of all of our webinars, we want to be sure that folks who are tuning in have an opportunity to ask their own questions. And the way that you do that is by going to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and submitting questions. You can do that anytime during the webinar, and I will pose as many of those questions as I can to our panelists. Want to let you all know that a recording of our discussion will be available today on our J Street Policy Center YouTube channel, which looks like one of my colleagues has already put into the chat, so you can watch the video there and share it with anyone you might like. And the same is true for a podcast episode of this webinar. The last thing that I want to mention before I introduce our speakers is the work of our policy team, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of. The policy team has produced an issue brief on this very topic, which is available on our Policy Center webpage. I'm sure one of my colleagues will put that link, there we go, into the chat. And so you can check out that particular issue brief and all of the work of the J Street Policy Center. I should mention that in that issue brief, you will find each of these three experts who are with us today quoted and or cited. They really are key experts who have been very much involved in this discussion. And so Without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce them. We have with us Bruce Riedel, who is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. In addition to a 30-year colorful career that I got to hear just a little bit about before this Zoom started, he was a senior advisor for Middle East and South Asia to 4 presidents. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Near East and South Asia, as well as a senior advisor to NATO. We have with us as well Hanin Ghaddar, who is a senior fellow in the Washington Institute's program on Arab politics. She focuses on Shia politics throughout the Levant, and she was managing editor of Lebanon's Now news website and worked as a researcher for the UN Development Program. I want to highlight for all of you that she's the author of a recent book that you may want to get your hands on, published in 2023, entitled Hezbollah Land, Mapping Dahiya and Lebanon's Shia Community. And with us as well, we have Eran Etzion, who was head of policy planning at Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he was deputy head of the National Security Council in the Prime Minister's office. He's been a visiting scholar at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and in 2015, he founded the Israel Center for Strategic Futures. So thank you so much to all of our esteemed guests for joining us today and shedding some light on this really important topic. As we get started, where I'd like for us to begin is on the current state of hostilities between Israel and Lebanon. And I would love for all of you to weigh in on that. We could perhaps have Bruce start out by giving us an overview of the current state of hostilities. And then I'd love to turn to Hanin and to Eran to give us a view on what the impact has been so far on Lebanon and Israel, respectively. So, Bruce, why don't we first turn to you?
Certainly. Hezbollah and Israel have been in a state of war since October 8th. It's a limited war. They have both, for their own reasons, decided to keep it limited so far. But I think we can see that we are increasingly on the precipice of those limits expiring. As you alluded to, we've already had serious public displacement of people. 90,000 or so Lebanese have been displaced from their homes, 60,000 or so Israelis. Much of the northern Israel frontier area is now all but completely abandoned by a civilian population. We've also had numerous casualties. There are at least 400 or so killed in Lebanon, of which it's estimated about 300 are Hezbollah fighters, and the rest are civilians. We've had 28 people killed on the Israeli side of the border, many of them soldiers, but also civilians as well. These death tolls should be taken with caution, because it's more likely there are more dead than we know about so far. We've seen recent indications of Hezbollah in particular threatening to escalate the conflict. The most dramatic by far was putting imagery taken by a drone up on the internet this week. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long. And in particular, the drone focuses on the city of Haifa, Israel's 3rd largest city, and particularly focuses on the Israeli naval port in the city. And it's a very dramatic way of Hezbollah saying that if we escalate, we can make life very, very difficult for the people who live in Haifa. Of course, Hezbollah has the capability to strike far further in to Israel than just Haifa. Um, it has an estimated 150,000 fighters. Now, I would be cautious with people. I learned early in my CIA career that estimates of the number of insurgents are usually wildly off base. For example, it was determined in 1969 by a CIA analyst that the Department of Defense had killed every member of the Viet Cong 3 times already in the war. So numbers of insurgents, be careful with. Similarly, Hezbollah is said to have somewhere like 150,000 missiles. In my own looking at this, that number was first put on public in 2017. So they've had 7 years to adapt and put more in. The last thing I would say is that we have an interview now with Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, in which he says that if there is an escalation, Hezbollah will launch a ground attack into the Galilee. That's a pretty significant threat. I don't believe Hezbollah has ever tried a significant ground offensive across the border before, but it's clearly an allusion to the Hamas 7 October attack and saying the same thing that could happen in Gaza in southern Israel could happen in northern Israel. He also somewhat, I don't know what the right word is, but somewhat unusually threatened to go to war with Cyprus, which prompted immediate statements by the government of Cyprus that it's not involved in the war in any way whatsoever. I'll leave the Cypriot question hanging, so there's where we stand on the precipice of what could be a catastrophe for both Israel and Lebanon.
Thanks so much for setting the scene for us. Hanin, would you like to jump in next, and then we'll turn to Eran?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for your a wonderful introduction, and it's great to be here with Bruce and Eran on this fascinating panel. I've studied Hezbollah, so I'm definitely going to focus on Hezbollah. I don't want to pretend that I know what the Israeli calculations are. I kind of understand it, but I'd leave all that to Eran. I think he knows better than me when it comes to Israeli calculations. I'd like to focus more on Hezbollah's calculations, priorities, and why they're doing what they're doing. Just try to understand the shift in their mission, the shift in their priorities, and why they have done what they've done so far. What are the challenges, and what are their scenarios for the future? And then maybe later we can go into the details of all that and the recent developments. So let me start with the shift in their mission and why they're doing this. Hassan Nasrallah had made it very clear from the very beginning that this is a Palestinian war. Gaza war is a Palestinian war. The first speech he came out the first speech he made after the Gaza war was basically to say that this is not our war. This is Gaza. This is the Palestinians. We're only here to support, but we are not going to start a war in order to liberate Palestine now. This is because since 2006, the last war with Israel, many things have changed. One, Hezbollah's mission, since they got involved in Syria with Qasem Soleimani drastically changed the core of Hezbollah's mission and raison d'etre. They no longer, in 2006 war, they were still a Lebanese army, an Iranian army in Lebanon, if you want. They were still very Lebanese in that sense. They focused on the resistance, focused on liberation of the occupied territories, focused on a very specific goal. This is no longer the case. What happened is that Qasem Soleimani shifted them as part of the Quds force, because Hezbollah is part of the Quds force. It's not just a proxy. He shifted their mission to become the IRGC regional force, basically. If any of the proxies need support, training, logistics, leadership, etc., Hezbollah is the key in that. So their mission has shifted, their priorities have shifted. That's why fighting Israel is still on the table. I'm not saying that they do not want to go after Israel, but they are today the IRGC, the Iranian regime's insurance policy. They will be unleashed in a big war when Iran feels that their regime is in direct threat, when their nuclear program is in direct threat, or when their regional interest, the serious interest, is in direct threat. So far, the Iranian regime doesn't feel this kind of threat. That's why Hezbollah is not using all its military assets. When I say military assets, so far Hezbollah is using limited advanced weapons. Like recently, they started using explosive drones, the third generation drones, 1 or 2 surface-to-air missiles, in the sense that they wanted to show what they can do, threatening Cyprus, shipping in the East Med today. Nasrallah, yesterday, Nasrallah threatened shipping in the East Med, threatened Cyprus. This doesn't mean that they're going to do this, because that would be stupid, and they're not stupid. It only means that they are flexing their muscles, trying to show what they can actually do if they are asked to go, if they were like really, Iran feels that this is the time. That's why they are being very calculated. We are seeing a lot of escalation from Israel and from Hezbollah. And I think Israel is more interested than, Israel is much more, I'm sorry about that. Israel is much more interested in a war against Hezbollah at one point, but Iran can say more about this. I think Hezbollah doesn't think, one, this is his war. This is definitely not the war that they're interested in launching. 2, they have serious commandment issues. They are, last claimed victory they had was since Imad Maghniya in 2006. Imad Maghniya was the last guy who had a military vision. Mustafa Badruddin, Qasim Soleimani, they were able to do it. Today, they don't have any of these people. They were killed, assassinated by different people. And their other second-class commanders are today being targeted one after another every day by Israel during this, like the war between wars. And third, they do not have the budget for war. They really need the budget. Not the budget for war. It's not just the budget to go to war. It's the post-war budget, which is reconstruction, and not reconstruction of the South, of the people. They are mostly interested in the reconstruction of their military arsenal, their military infrastructure. The problem today for them is that they can keep this up to a certain extent, but the damage done to them is much more than the damage done to the Israelis, the IDF, etc. There's a lot of damage done to Lebanon. Lebanon is losing much needed touristic season, and like it's a shambles. They cannot take care of these 90,000 Lebanese. No compensations can be given by the Lebanese government. The Lebanese themselves have no hope in anything. So Lebanon and the Lebanese are the big losers here. But in terms of military damage, Hezbollah is getting a lot of more damage than the infrastructure south of Litani is, their military infrastructure south of Litani is gone. There's nothing left. And they're hitting their commanders and leadership. So at one point, something's gonna give, and Hezbollah says, like, if we don't use them, we will lose them. And they might actually feel that this is an existential threat for them. Until then, I'm seeing a lot of escalation, rhetorical escalation, a lot of serious military escalation that could go out of proportions any minute because of a mistake, because someone hits the wrong target at one point. But it's still calculated, and it's still muscle flexing so far. Hochstein is understood finally that nothing can be done now, because Hezbollah made it very clear to everyone that as long as the war in Gaza is going on, Hezbollah will not stop. So there's no way for Hezbollah to separate Gaza from Lebanon. That's why Hochstein's mission is complicated, because he wants to separate Gaza from Lebanon. Hezbollah is refusing. And I think Israel wants a lot more than what Hochstein also is proposing. So it is a serious issue. And the problem today is that, and I leave this to Eran to stop here and go, and I can go more later, is if Israel wants to go after Hezbollah at this point, maybe they are more interested in a war than Hezbollah. But I think from being in Washington, hearing all the narrative here, is that Washington is not interested in war now, at least not before the presidential elections. And Israel needs political, military, logistical, financial support from Washington if it wants to go to a war against Hezbollah, because this is not a joke. This is going to be a big, very, very long war. And so far, Washington is saying no. So I'll stop here and can go back to all details later.
Eran, I think Hanin set you up very nicely, so why don't you jump right in there?
Yes, she did. First of all, thanks, J Street, Debra, for the invitation. It's great to be here. Thanks for everybody who's on the call. I see the numbers are quite impressive, 403 participants. With your permission, what I'm going to do is to try and paint perhaps a slightly broader picture the way I see it. And then if we have time, either right now or shortly after, I'll go deeper into the Israeli side. I have some points about Israel, but I want to make a few more general points about the overall situation, because I think it's important. At least some of it is, I think, under-discussed or not discussed at all in the public discourse. So I have 8 fundamentals that I want to present quickly. One, Hezbollah and Israel both do not seek escalation. That's pretty, I think, widely agreed upon. 2, and this is following directly on what Hanin was just saying, the nexus, the linkage between Gaza and the north, the way that Hezbollah and Iran constructed it, in my opinion, is not breakable. Not by Hochstein, not by anybody else. The conflict in the north will only end after the conflict in Gaza will end. So it's, for those of us who remember the Gaza First scheme in the context of the Oslo Accord, we're now again in the Gaza First scheme.
Eran, I want to interrupt you for a second, because I think I'm sure there are folks who would like to understand a little bit better why this connection. So can you just, between the north and the south, explain it?
Well, it's essentially, and Hanin may agree or disagree, I think there's a very grand Iranian scheme at work here that has been building up for decades, linking the various Iranian proxies. Now, obviously, Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy and Hamas is not entirely an Iranian proxy, but Iran has managed to coordinate this so-called choke ring around Israel, including the Houthis, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, including pro-Iranian Iraqi militias, including many pro-Iranian militias in Syria and the Syrian regime itself, and obviously Hezbollah, to link them all in a coordinated scheme that is ready to take Israel on under certain conditions. And yes, there are different interests and so on. It's complicated, but to simplify, this is the bigger scheme of things. And now it's questionable to what extent Hamas has or has not coordinated the exact timing of October 7th. Okay, there's a big discussion on that. I actually believe that there was some level of coordination. But at any rate, the minute it erupted, Hezbollah decided that it will chip in, not by entering, and again, every sentence here we can debate, for a long, long time. Was Hezbollah at some point really interested in going in fully and then deterred because of the famous don't speech by Biden and by some other messages that were obviously handed to it directly by the Americans and via third parties and so on? I think it's possible. I think it's very possible that there was a bigger Hezbollah scheme on October 7th or 8th, and it was stopped partially by the Americans. But at any rate, this is the bigger scheme. Okay, there's a level of coordination orchestrated by Iran, including Hezbollah and Hamas, and the idea is to pressure Israel from multi-fronts, the so-called multi-front war, and this is what we're seeing. So, and it is effective. It is stretching the IDF. It is making it very difficult for Israel to manage the war, and we're struggling, and they're succeeding. That's the bottom line. So that was point number 2 about the nexus and the sequence. So it's going to have to be Gaza first. Point number 3, and this is very important. All the calculuses of all the various actors regarding the strategic calculuses are constantly being updated and kind of remade, but all of them, and I'm sure that's true about Israel, I'm sure it's true about Iran, and I think it's true about Hezbollah. All of them are at a point where they might very well change dramatically. Okay, it has exhausted itself to a certain extent from the perspective of Israel, possibly from the perspective of Iran, and possibly also from the perspective of Hezbollah, and also maybe from the perspective of the US. Okay, it has sort of exhausted itself, and we should not be surprised if we see some dramatic developments in the short period, because the formulas, the calculations, again, I think many of the actors are feeling that, you know, this can no longer, it doesn't serve us as well as it did, let's say, a few months ago, and we need to rethink it. And it's true about Israel. So some extreme scenarios that up until a few weeks ago, I, for example, would have said, you know, are not on the table. Now I would say they are, including the possibility of full-scale regional war, including the possibility of very heavy Iranian involvement. Again, I'm not saying this is necessarily, you know, imminent or highly probable even, but it's possible, and the probability is growing as time goes on. Number 4, if and when a war does erupt, escalation will be very quick and very dramatic, and then it's highly doubtful if the US will be in a position to stop it. And certainly they will not be in a position to stop it on their own. So, and again, this is very important and critical and not talked about enough. Here is the situation. If and when such a war erupts, what it means is the minute it erupted, it is a failure, a major failure of American deterrence against Iran and against Hezbollah, and also a failure to rein in or restrain Israel. Failure number 1. Failure number 2 will expose itself very quickly, because the world will see that the US is not in a position to end this war quickly. So it will be exposed. The limitations to the power and influence of the US will be exposed. And it's not a coincidence they're working so hard to try and prevent it. How will they be able to end it? They will need Iranian assistance, and I also think they will need Russian assistance. And that's not discussed at all, the potential Russian role here. I can elaborate further if you want afterwards. And Russia here will have an opportunity to exact the price from the US, and the Russians are very good at using strategic opportunity. Number 5, we are at a very high probability of a multi-front war if and when a Hezbollah-Israel war erupts. Multi-front meaning the Houthis, the Iraqi pro-Iranian militias, I already mentioned that, the Syrian militias and all of that. And there will be a big flow of jihadists from all across the region and beyond, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, where have you. They will all be flowing via Syria into Lebanon to fight Israel on the Lebanese front and on the Golan front. And there's going to be very little that anybody can do about it. Obviously, the Syrians will do nothing, if not encourage it. And Israel will not have the power to stop it. The Americans, well, we'll see what they will do. So we'll have that. We'll have Arab capitals, including Cairo and Amman, up in, you know, there will be a lot of chaos in the streets. And there's an open question about the West Bank, to what extent it will erupt as well. So that's a very difficult scenario. And again, if and when we do have an eruption between Hezbollah and Israel, the domino effect across all those different arenas is very probable. Point number 6, the end state. In the best case I can imagine, we're looking at a variation on 1701, but with a great amount of difficulty to agree on a mandate for the international force. Israel will have...
Eran, sorry, I need to stop you because probably everyone on the call doesn't know what UN Security Council Resolution 1701 is. Can you just give us a brief primer?
1701 was the UN Security Council resolution that ended the Second Lebanon War back in 2006. And essentially, it called for the creation of a demilitarized zone on the Lebanese side of the border, relatively deep into Lebanon, not South Lebanon, if you will. And also it had some provisions about the Syria-Lebanon war. And UNIFIL, the international UN force, was there before, but it was reinforced and its mandate was updated. So essentially, this was the conflict-ending resolution for the Second Lebanon War. It was not implemented fully for, again, a variety of reasons, but it did last, and it did create, what is it, how many years since 2006, calm in the Lebanon-Israel border. An absolute calm, one could say. You know, there was really very stable, calm situation, and everybody who visited Israel and Israel's north would have been able to, you know, spend the night in a nice hotel or whatever, and the tourism was flourishing and the economy was booming and so on. So while it is often criticized, 1701, for not being implemented and for the weaknesses of the UNIFIL force and for the fact that Hezbollah was able to build a tremendous amount of military capability against actually the language of the resolution. Nevertheless, it provided, again, an extended amount of very significant and important calm. So the best possible scenario I can see, and that's also the scenario that Hochstein is working on, and that's the working assumption, I think, of all actors, that if we don't get to a war and we are able to have a deal for Gaza, which will extend to the north, the deal in the north will be based on 1701. If we do get to a war and it escalates and so on, and after, you know, whichever period, weeks, months, whatnot, we get to a conflict-ending scheme or resolution, it will be a variation on 1701. And again, we'll be in these discussions that us professionals are very familiar with on the exact mandate, the wording of the mandate of the international force that will need to enforce the new resolution on the ground and on Hezbollah. And then the role of the Lebanese army, and whether or not Hezbollah, to what extent will Hezbollah be pushed away from the border, and so on and so forth. But the point is that I think there will be it's going to be very difficult to agree on the mandate for the force. Iran, as I said before, will now play a direct role. It will be almost, if you want, it's if not officially, then unofficially, a party to this resolution. And Russia will represent it in the UN Security Council. And it's going to be, therefore, much more difficult to arrive at a conflict-ending language. Last point, point 7 and 8, which is very quick. Point 7 is Iran again. And to me, there is a very big question mark on the level of involvement, direct involvement of Iran in a potential Israel-Hezbollah war. And this, again, has changed dramatically in the course of the last 3 months, because a very critical threshold was crossed, as we all know. Iran attacked Israel directly, significantly, coordinated with the US. That's also very important. There were ongoing discussions and coordinations between the US and Iran before that attack, almost, I would say, during that attack and after that attack. And on the one hand, the US is trying very hard to deter Iran, and Iran, to a certain extent, one could argue, was deterred, is deterred. On the other hand, I do think now it's much more probable, and we don't have time to elaborate, but I think Iran identifies a historic opportunity here for a variety of reasons, and it's very possible that they will not be able to kind of contain the temptation to enter into this war, if indeed it erupts between Israel and Hezbollah. And then the big question is, you know, what kind of involvement, to what extent, and what kind of involvement will they have in the conflict ending mechanism and all of that. That's it. And the last point is, can we, as a result of that, and this is, I know, going very far, and I'm now playing the role of a strategic planner, assuming we did have a war, we were able to end it somehow, I think now we will need to ask ourselves two important questions. One, can we get into a de-escalation mechanism and even truce negotiations between Israel and Iran, which I think are going to be very important? And what kind of a regional security architecture can we imagine, can we work towards in the aftermath of such a war, which obviously will be terrible? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Eran. We have a number of great questions from folks in our Q&A, and I'm going to start weaving some of those in. And Bruce, I want to pose one of them to you, and it really gets into something that's been touched on thus far in our conversation, and that is the role of the United States. Clearly, the U.S. has very strong reasons, incentives to try to de-escalate the situation, and we know that the U.S. is with Amos Hochstein and otherwise been very much involved in this. The question that we have from one of our audience members is what the U.S. would do if the war does in fact escalate. And the question specifically is, would the U.S. enter the conflict? Would we send troops? And what would be the implications of all of that on U.S. domestic politics as we are in the run-up to an election? So Bruce, let you tackle all of that, if you would. Certainly.
The United States has numerous interests that are at stake in this conflict. The country of Lebanon has not been an American priority now for a long time. But Israel is very much an American priority. It has been for every president going back to Harry S. Truman. The imagery of an Israeli city like Haifa or Tel Aviv as well, under fire from Iranian-backed group would have enormous implications in American domestic politics. I would say far more than what we've seen from the war in Gaza. While the war in Gaza has led to some displacement of Israelis in the south, this would be nothing like the kind of damage that could be brought about by Hezbollah using its precision-guided missiles against Israel, and of course Israel's response against Lebanon and into Syria as well. And as others have noted, the administration is well aware of this. It has sent a senior diplomat there that is trying to use its instruments to calm the situation down. Here we are in the very unfortunate position that because the Trump administration violated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, we no longer have the kind of high-level dialogue that we had in the second Obama administration. It's easy to forget now, but in the second Obama administration, Secretary of State Kerry regularly talked to his Iranian counterparts on an almost daily basis. We don't have that. We don't have that line of communications anymore. We don't have a line of communication directly with Hezbollah. We regard Hezbollah as a terrorist group, which it is a terrorist group. We don't have communications with them. We have very little on-the-ground presence. Our mission in Lebanon is limited. Security is not good for them to move around. So our ability to leverage the situation is pretty weak. We have tried to deter Iran in the last few months, but as has also been alluded to, the Iranian attack on Israel, although not terribly successful, demonstrated very much the limits of American deterrence vis-a-vis Iran. Just parenthetically say, I think that the fact that the Iranian attack on Israel proved to be so ineffective will in the long run be seen as a decisive moment in moving Iran from not just having the capability of a nuclear weapon, but of actually acquiring a nuclear weapons arsenal, which would be something the United States very much doesn't want to see. The other thing I would say is many of our closest allies in the Middle East, and I would particularly highlight Jordan, are already on knife's edge. The war in Gaza has put tremendous pressure on pro-American governments like the government of King Abdullah, and we could see that result in serious violence in the streets and perhaps even in the instability of the entire kingdom. So we have huge interest at stake here. In terms of domestic American politics, if we see further alienation of the Arab American community and Arab Muslim American community, I think President Biden's reelection hopes are in serious question mark. My son lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he tells me there is no way right now Biden can win the state of Michigan. Of course, all of that would be a tragedy in many, many ways, but the biggest tragedy of all is that, you know, Donald Trump's not going to care about ending the war in Lebanon. He doesn't have a plan, and he doesn't have a team that could invoke a plan. So there's a lot at stake here for the United States, but unfortunately, our capacity to get things done is very, very limited. And last thing I would say, in terms of sequencing, I completely agree. We're back to Gaza first, ironically, and that's where we really need an American effort to get a ceasefire, and that's where we have more leverage, certainly more leverage vis-a-vis Israel on getting a ceasefire in Gaza. And I would like to see the administration put real shoulder to the wheel on trying to get a ceasefire in Gaza and create an international peacekeeping force that could provide some degree of law and order for the long run in Gaza and head us firmly on the path to a two-state solution.
Thanks so much for that, Bruce, and amen to your last point, absolutely. But I do just want to follow up with you for just a second. If the worst case scenario here that we're considering does come to pass, what specifically do you see the U.S. under the Biden administration as likely to do militarily? I mean, to what extent do you think the U.S. would defend Israel, and how would it even extend to troops?
I think the good news for the American people here is the Israel Defense Forces does not need American boots on the ground to fight its enemies. The Israelis have the boots on the ground. What they need, of course, is the ammunition, the weapon systems. That is flowing in unprecedented amounts to Israel already. We haven't seen this kind of a massive maneuver of American equipment to Israel really since the October War in 1973. The Israelis, I don't think, want American boots on the ground, but inevitably there is a risk that American military forces in the region will be targeted by, if not Hezbollah, other jihadists who will see the Americans as a very useful target to go after. And we've already seen in the Red Sea, one of Hezbollah's closest allies, the Houthis, create a situation which is very, very damaging to global maritime traffic. We may be bombing the Houthis in Yemen frequently, but that doesn't seem to have any impact on their capacity to carry out attacks on maritime traffic. And those attacks are now leading to a serious displacement of maritime activity away from the Suez Canal, which has very serious implications for the Egyptian economy, which is very much dependent upon revenue coming out of the Suez Canal. So here we have another American ally, Egypt, that is potentially at the point of seeing some serious internal political unrest. And if you have a political unrest, destabilization of Egypt and Jordan, then the whole edifice of America's role in the Middle East will be crumbling around you. That's why I would just stress again, get on the task of getting a ceasefire in Gaza, which hopefully will open the door to getting a ceasefire in the Galilee and a ceasefire in the Red Sea.
Thank you so much for that, Bruce. We are getting a huge volume of really smart questions from our very smart audience in the Q&A, and I'm going to do my best to field as many as we can. We won't get to all of them, I'm afraid, but Hanin, I do want to come to you, and I'm going to pose a couple of questions from our audience members. And one of them has to do with the Lebanese domestic situation. And the question, I mean, you talked about Hezbollah effectively becoming the IRGC's, regional force in southern Lebanon. But at the same time, Hezbollah, of course, is also a Lebanese domestic actor. So the question is, with Lebanon in a state of political paralysis, with the very desperate situation in Lebanon's economy since 2019, to what extent where is Lebanon's political opinion, public opinion? Could that restrain Hezbollah in any way? Are there constituencies within Lebanon, like, for example, the Christians who would side against Hezbollah, and what might that mean? So if you could kind of talk about the Lebanese domestic situation a bit for us. I'm going to throw in another question that we had from one of our audience members who raised an important Arab regional player that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, being a country that reached a rapprochement with Iran prior to all of this. What role could Saudi Arabia play? What would be the impact on Saudi Arabia? And if you want to throw in any important additional Arab regional players that are worth mentioning in this context, I'm going to throw all of that over to you, Hanin.
All right, I will try my best to be brief because this is a 2-hour conversation and I don't want to take, I know we have limited time. So just to be very, very brief, the public opinion, it's part of my research. I do this, it's part of the book that I've written, it's part of everything that I do. I always look at domestics, and I know from all my research, from municipal elections numbers, from the social media, from talking to, like internal parties and their own numbers, Hezbollah is definitely not as popular as it used to be in 2006. There have been many stages. The first stage, obviously, was May 7 events of 2008, when they held their first time their weapons against the Lebanese people. This started to degrade their popularity, but mostly in the Sunni street. Second one was Syria. Syria was a huge blow to Hezbollah's popular support for many reasons, but also within the Shia community. And this was the first shift within the Shia community, where a lot of people did not understand why Hezbollah is fighting in Syria, not Israel. And it's basically for them something that they believed at first, but then they had many questions, especially losing so many people for no apparent reason. The big, huge shift within Hezbollah's public support. And I'm here talking about the Shia because the Christians and the Sunnis never really liked Hezbollah since 2005. And except for the Aounists who had their strategic alliance, but not really a love relationship. And within the Shia community, the shift started to become really apparent in 2019 when the protests of 2019, when Hezbollah stood with the corrupt political elite against the protesters and used violence and arms against the protesters, especially in Shia streets. Nabatie, Sur, Dahi, Baalbek, Hermel, all these Shia cities were full of people who wanted change. And they thought that Hezbollah would support that because they're fighting corruption, injustice, and this is Hezbollah's narrative. No, it's not. So they went after them. A lot of my friends in the South, I am personally from the South, from a Shia town. A lot of my friends were, after the protests, they were followed home, cameras taken, threatened, parents threatened everything to make sure that the Shia community does not go to the street anymore. This was the big shift. Last but not least is the Beirut port explosion and Hezbollah's apparent involvement in storing the nitrate, destroying literally half of Beirut, and the Hezbollah threatening the judge who was trying to follow the case. This is all just to say, to show you that Hezbollah sacrifices popular support. Actually, it's for power. The way the Lebanese see Hezbollah, especially today, when they have opened Lebanon with all the economic catastrophes that Lebanon is facing, financial difficulties, people losing hope over everything. Summer is the only hope for some private sector making some money, especially in the South, and now it's gone. Hezbollah is being blamed and not supported for what they're doing in Lebanon today. They are not seen by the Lebanese as Lebanese. Yes, they have the Lebanese identities, the Lebanese passports, but they have Iran's interests first. And this is not, so what they see them is the Lebanese people, the majority of the Lebanese people, of course, a lot of people still support Hezbollah, but I would say 20% of the Shia community now support Hezbollah, not more than that. Definitely not more than that. It has eroded drastically. And the people of Lebanon see Hezbollah as an Iranian occupation. Nothing more than that. Yes, they are Lebanese people. They speak Lebanese accent, but they have Iran's interest first. And that means Lebanon is occupied by Iran. And the Lebanese have zero sovereignty, zero agency, zero hope for anything unless something changes there. This is how the Lebanese people see Hezbollah. In terms of, sorry, what was your second question? Iran, yes, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is gone. Saudi Arabia gave up Lebanon long time ago after all the investment that they have done in Lebanon with Hariri and Hariri Jr. And finally realizing that the corruption is much bigger in Lebanon than actually change. You know, like a lot of these March 14 leadership that wanted sovereignty and change and independence, yes, the values were there, but their corruption was much bigger than Saudi plans for Lebanon. And they just let the gun. Saudi is now looking internally, 2030, economic projects, diverting to work with everyone instead of taking sides. They work with China, with Russia. They don't know, no one cares really about, you know, like they're not taking sides. They're working on a deal with the US. They are very much focused on that because for them, economy is number one and security is needed in order to protect the economy. Being involved in Lebanon is not key for them. It's not a priority. Yemen is more a priority now today for them than Lebanon. Internal GCC security, definitely not Lebanon. However, and this is something that a colleague of mine and I, Eran, and I wrote about it just recently, our last policy watch. It is interesting to see that they are starting to worry, and this is a trend that we're seeing in Lebanon, in Jordan, in different places, that the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brothers, relationship to Hamas, and in Lebanon, under the umbrella and protection of Hezbollah, is becoming very serious. In Jordan, it is serious. In Lebanon, this joint operation room that started before October 7, that included Hamas, Hezbollah, and Hamas. After this joint operation room, there was a political presence for Hamas in Lebanon, but never a military presence. And suddenly they are part of the confrontation in the south. So in addition, as Iran said, to all the militias from Iraq and Syria and Yemen coming to Lebanon to join the war with Hezbollah and turning it into a regional war, by the way, not just in Lebanon, you will have Hezbollah's own proxies, which is Hamas Lebanon, which are armed to the teeth, and the Muslim Brothers who have been part of the confrontation, and others and Saraya al-Muqawami and others. So, but my problem with all that, from Saudi Arabia to Israel, to America, to everyone who is involved in this conflict one way or another, no one really sees this with a long-term vision. And I think we come back to these conflicts every time, and we come back to unimplemented 1701 and unimplemented resolutions and who does what. We come back to these conflicts every single time because there's zero long-term vision. No one wants to work long-term. And long-term, in my opinion, is not just security of the borders. Everybody wants to look at the security of the borders. And that was Israel's main mistake, is to see Hezbollah threat as a border threat. It's not a border threat. As long as Hezbollah, Iran said something that is true, that 1701, there was peace in Israel and everybody was flourishing. But not the case in Lebanon. That's why we are here, because it was temporary, because nobody had a long-term plan. And I think that if we want to empower 1701 version that you think, and also link it to a long-term plan, we cannot separate 1701 with 1559 from 1559. 1559 deals with the other side of the border, the Syria-Lebanon border, where all the smuggling happens. If this border is not dealt with, your border will never be dealt with. And these two resolutions have to work hand in hand. Syria is key. Syria is key to all these conflicts because this is the hub where everything comes through, including the Russians, including, like Syria is key. If you don't, again, long-term, if you don't resolve Syria, you cannot really resolve the conflicts. This will stop at one point. We will find another resolution that is barely implemented, and then we will come back to this again and again and again and again. Long-term vision is absent, and I think this is the main issue. We've written about linking the two resolutions together, laid, like a lot of policy recommendations. Everybody takes the recommendations that work temporarily, but never long-term, because no one wants to think about it. So I'm going to stop here because I barely have like a couple of minutes left so that we can listen to Eran.
Thank you so much, Hanin. I mean, all of that was so interesting, and I'm sure really informative for all of our folks. So Eran, I am going to turn to you, and folks may not be surprised to hear that there are a lot of questions and comments in the Q&A, specifically about Netanyahu and his role in this situation. And so I would love for you, and I know, Eran, you have a strong perspective on all of this. And so I'd love for you to talk about the domestic political situation in Israel, and not only factoring in Netanyahu, and I'm sure many of our folks saw the short video that Netanyahu made the other day, slamming the Biden administration for not sending enough weapons. What is he doing there in terms of the Israeli-US relationship? What is the potential for political change in Israel, and to what extent would that make a difference in calculations on this particular issue that we're talking about? But also, I want to hear about one other thing, Eran, which is Israeli public opinion and what Israelis think about the problem of Hezbollah in the north. Do Israelis want to see a broader war and think that that's the only way that the problem of Hezbollah could be dealt with? The possibility of Israelis returning to their homes in the north. What's public opinion like in Israel? So I'm going to turn all of that over to you, Eran.
How much time do I have? No, seriously, just so I know. 5 minutes?
Can you take about 5 minutes max? Would that be possible?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So first of all, just a quick follow-up on what Hanin was saying. I don't think it's true that nobody wants to think about the long term. Unfortunately, there are some actors who do want and think about the long term and are doing it very effectively. And that's number one, Iran. Number two, Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, more generally, they have long-term plans and they're executing them. And in Israel, there are Muslim Brotherhood, there's a Muslim Brotherhood, and there's a Jewish Brotherhood. So the Jewish Brotherhood of Smotrich and the fundamentalists, the zealots, the Kahanists, they are also thinking long-term, unfortunately. They think God is on their side. They have the perspective of eternity. That's the way they do strategy. And, you know, all of us won't be here to judge them when Judgment Day comes. But seriously, that's how they think. And it's very frightening when people like that actually have a very significant amount of power on the allegedly or theoretically democratic government of Israel, including budgets, including, you know, war cabinet, including everything. That's where we are. So, so that's just a comment I wanted to make. Now, regarding Netanyahu and Israeli public opinion and all that, what Netanyahu is trying to do is very simple and very clear. He also has a strategy, and it's also long-term, relatively speaking. You know, he doesn't have that many years to live, but he has been executing a very effective long-term political strategy of survival, the costs of which have been skyrocketing, but it is still working for him. He is still in power. And on October 8th, probably he himself and most Israelis did not believe that, you know, almost a year now after October 7th, he will still be in power. Now, if you were to push me for an assessment of how long this political strategy of his will continue to be effective and for how long he will be in power, I don't think he will last very long, but admittedly, it has worked so far. So what he's doing, he's surviving. What is the price for that? October 7th is the price of that. Everything that transpired since is the price of that. The strategic relations between Israel and the US is the price of that. The relations between Israel and Europe is the price of that. Relations between Israel and Egypt is the price of that. Relations between Israel and the majority of American Jews is the price of that. And we'll see a demonstration of that on July, when is it exactly, 23rd or something?
24th.
If indeed he is invited to Washington and it's not revoked, which I hope it will be. And I can, for the life of me, cannot understand why did the Democratic side sign off on the invitation. It was a huge mistake. It should be revoked as soon as possible. He mustn't be allowed an audience at the White House. This guy is working against the Israeli national security interests. He's doing it 24/7. He's creating a tremendous amount of damage. It's costing the lives and the souls of many, many, many Israeli soldiers and civilians, and it must be stopped. Personally, I'm involved in the pro-democracy protest against him. But as I said before, 70–80% of Israelis want him out, and we need early elections as soon as possible. As Senator Schumer was saying very correctly, and unfortunately he didn't repeat it and was not joined enough by other Democrats and other influentials in the States. He said Netanyahu lost his way, which is absolutely true, and Israel needs to go to elections, which is absolutely true as well. And we're now in a situation where we are at a botched war run by a person who is unfit for office. That's the opinion of most Israelis. That's the opinion of the American administration. That's the opinion of all Israeli allies. And, you know, nothing good is going to come out of his political strategy. And each and every day that he stays in office is a net tremendous amount of damage for Israel. Now, in terms of the wider Israeli public opinion, and with this I will end, thinking about Lebanon and trying to kind of gear towards different scenarios. Unfortunately, again, Israeli media is betraying its role as the guardian of democracy and free speech. It's true about Gaza and it's true about Lebanon. And it's true about the government, it's true about everything now in Israel. Unfortunately, living in Israel now is a lot like living in Russia in terms of the media environment. A lot of fake news, a lot of falsehoods and psyops being operated by the government and its cronies and proxies. And people do not understand, not what's happening in Gaza, not even what's happening in the Israeli north. You don't see on Israeli TV the extent of the damage that Hezbollah has already impacted on Israel, which is tremendous and unprecedented. but it's being censored by the government, and the media is cooperating. So when Israelis are kind of driven to think about the next Lebanon war, they're, by and large, the government is painting a picture, the government and its supporters, and some in the military and some in the media, not all, are painting a picture of, okay, you know, first we took Gaza, now we'll take Beirut and Lebanon, as if it's just a walk in the park. And even those who are saying, yes, there will be some damage, and yes, there will be some rockets that will be hitting Haifa and even Tel Aviv. The average Israeli is not close to an understanding of the severity of the damage that will be incurred. There are lone voices that are talking about it, but you know, if you look at the kind of the average person again, the overall public opinion, they're being led to believe that there is a military solution to the Hezbollah problem, and it's only a question of an Israeli decision to decide to do it, and then we'll be able to do it, which of course is a complete fallacy. There is no military solution. Israel does not have that solution. If, God forbid, we embark on this kind of an adventure, it will be horrible. It's a war that we will lose in the first 24 hours. As I think Bruce was saying, those pictures of collapsing towers in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, and so on, which will happen because we don't have an answer for it, no matter what. It will be a moral loss and a political loss in the first 24 hours. And then it matters not what happens after. It's exactly like October 7th, okay? No matter the amount of damage that we created in Gaza, the number of casualties that we created for in terms of Gaza, including civilians and all of that, we have still lost that war on October 7th. And it will be exactly the same in Lebanon. So I'm trying to do what I can in order to, you know, spread these views. I'm not alone. There are some former officials, military officials, generals, and so on, who are speaking in similar terms, and that's encouraging. There are also some voices within the IDF who are, you know, anonymously, because obviously they cannot do it openly, are essentially trying to tell the Israeli public via the media that, you know, a third Lebanon war now, under these conditions and under this government, and with this state of affairs between Israel and the US, and with this political calendar in the US, and with all sorts of other calculations, not least the fact that we have already been fighting for almost 9 months, and there is fatigue, and there is a problem with the reservists, and there is a problem with armaments, and so on and so forth, then maybe it's not the best of ideas to go for an initiated third Lebanon war. So again, to end with a somewhat optimistic note, I still think chances are it will be avoided, mainly because of American pressures and realization within the Israeli army and within parts of the Israeli political elites and others, that, you know, Israel right now is not ready for a wider war, but rather we need a strategic timeout. We need to go for elections. We need to replace Netanyahu. We need fresh leadership, fresh strategy, fresh military leadership, and a lot of kind of rebuilding has to take place before we can entertain the notion of another Lebanon war. Thank you.
Thank you, Eran, and thank you for all you're doing. So we need to wrap up. We're coming to the end of our 75 minutes together. So what I'd like to do is, Bruce, you have decades-long perspective and involvement in this region and on these issues. And I would just, if you have any final thoughts, kind of contextualizing where we are right now and what needs to happen, I'd love to hear that from you. And then if Hanin or Eran want to just jump in with a last thought, if there's anything that you wanted to say and hadn't had a chance to say yet, you could do that. But I'd like to turn it over to Bruce now, if that works for you, Bruce. Bruce, you need to unmute, please.
There we go. The Middle East, as I've always said, is always a mess. But I don't think I've seen it in this state of disrepair in a long, long time. There is no real peace process underway. Israel is not making any real effort to find a just and final settlement with the Palestinian people. Instead, we're in a war that has now gone on for well over 200 days. We haven't seen that kind of conflict in the Middle East since back in the 1982 Operation Peace for Galilee. Operation Peace for Galilee became a disaster. It cost Menachem Begin his political career. And we're in a similar situation here. I couldn't agree more with the comment that what Israel needs is a strategic pause, elections, and new leadership. That is exactly why Bibi Netanyahu doesn't want to end the war. And I think that has dawned on the Biden administration far more slowly than it should have. The United States needs to ramp up its efforts on this front, not just for ceasefires, but for putting us on a road to a real political solution of this problem. And I would say one last thing. In 2000, Bill Clinton came within literally yards of a peace deal between Israel and Syria. At the Shepherdstown negotiations, we had 99% of a deal done. It was only a matter of a few yards on the northeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. We should have gone further. We should have made that happen. And I remember very distinctly talking to the Syrians about what will happen to Hezbollah if we get a deal between Israel and Syria. And the Syrian answer was, don't worry about that. We'll take care of that problem. We know how to deal with groups like Hezbollah. And the message was obvious. We need to get back to that kind of diplomacy. We need to be much more even-handed in the future in that diplomacy. We should not be the lawyer, judge, advocate for one side or the other, but a neutral observer who is prepared to use all measures of leverage we have to impose a deal if that's what it takes at the end of the day. The notion that Israelis and Arabs can somehow negotiate a deal by themselves, yes, that was true between King Hussein and the Israelis for the Israeli-Jordan agreement. In fact, the Jordanians did everything they could to keep us out of that deal. But that was a very straightforward deal. No territory of consequence with the dispute. This is a much more complicated problem, and it's going to take a Herculean American effort with the support of our European allies, and hopefully with the support of influential players on the ground, like Egypt, like Qatar, like Jordan. It's not going to be easy, but as we've discussed in the last hour, the alternative of towers crashing in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Beirut are just too awful to even contemplate. We need really to get involved in this and try very, very hard.
Hanin, Eran, would either of you like to just quick last thoughts?
Yeah.
Eran, and then Hanin, if you'd like.
Again, on an optimistic note, ultimately, we must not forget that as of the last, 6 months or so, there is a plan to end the conflict that is on the table, so-called the Biden plan, that starts with Gaza, goes through Lebanon, Hezbollah, and then moves on to the big Saudi deal, including the Israeli annex of it, and a new regional security architecture. It's there, it's in the offing. And any reasonable Israeli prime minister and government would have seized on it a long time ago. So it is still possible. And admittedly, it's complicated. I don't want to delude anybody. It's very ambitious and so on. Nevertheless, if we do have a scenario in which we go for elections, we elect a new government within a relatively short period of time. Unfortunately, according to Israeli law, unlike British law and so on, we cannot do it within a few weeks. It needs to be 90 days at least. But if we can do it, let's say by October, and we have a new government, and this new government enters into negotiations on the basis of the Biden deal and starts implementing it. And then we have the American elections, in which hopefully Biden will win, as difficult as it seems right now. And even if, even if Biden doesn't win, I actually think that, in that eventuality, Trump will not disrupt such a positive progress. But regarding Israel and its policy and the way to end this conflict, it's on the table. The plan is there. All we need is an Israeli partner, which is not Netanyahu and not an ultra right-wing government that is willing to negotiate on its basis. And this will take us on an entirely new and positive direction. Of course, Hamas will not necessarily play along, and don't want to oversimplify. But it's not like, everything is in flux, there is no way out, and, everything is lost. No, there is a solution. It's on the table. Any reasonable prime minister and government would have taken it a long time ago, and the new government of Israel hopefully will take it once it's in power.
Thank you, Eran. Hanin.
I just 1 minute just to say that also a continuation of what Eran said, that there is a way out. I think until then, this phase for Israel, not for Hezbollah, for Israel is much more effective than an actual full-scale war. Because so far, Hezbollah has not been using its military assets. We're talking about Radwan forces. We're talking about the precision missiles that actually are haven't been used, but could really harm Israel's main infrastructure, water, electricity, airports, everything. They haven't used them, and they haven't really used their long-range surface-to-air missiles that have been used just as a flex button. So I'm saying, like Israel can avoid all this damage that Hezbollah can make. And war would definitely not resolve the problem, which is the north. People are not, there will be more displacement with the war, and it will not actually solve Hezbollah's problem, because as long as the Syria border is open, Hezbollah will continue growing, and it will set them back a little bit. It's not going to solve Hezbollah's problem. But what's happening today is an opportunity to avoid all that, more displacement, infrastructure damage, etc., while actually using, targeting Hezbollah's assets without risking Hezbollah's strong response. So I think this is much more effective without even causing a lot of civilian, there has been civilian casualties, but nothing compared to the 2006 war. Yes, south of Litani is empty. Yes, a lot of Lebanese are displaced, but 2006 was much more. It was on the humanitarian scale. It was disastrous. It was people. A lot of people died. Now more Hezbollah fighters are dying, more than civilians. So I think this is more effective, and a war would make it worse, not better. And I think Israel understands this. And so far, this narrative escalation is much more apparent than the actual thinking on the ground. So I hope this continues and not really develop quickly into something. I hope both sides understand why this is more effective.
Thank you for that, Hanin. And thank you so much to all of our three speakers for the most intelligent discussion on this topic that I have heard. And it's really been a privilege to be able to talk with the three of you. And I'm so grateful for your taking the time today.
Thank you for having us, Debra. It's so
Thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you to our hundreds of audience members who joined us today, and look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. Thank you.